Welcome back, all you space lovers. It's craziness of the internet here, and we are back again with another informational video here in EVE Online. Now today we are going to be going over the 4 major factions here in the game and what you need to understand about these factions when you do choose them on the battlefield, as each one of these factions do bring a different playstyle and utility when they are engaged in player-to-player interaction. So once you do understand the basics and the utility each faction does bring to the battlefield, it does in the end make it easier for you to decide which playstyle does favor your PvP interaction here in the game. Now we are not going to be spending a lot of time here on the lore aspects of the factions, but we are going to be spending our time here understanding how these factions play out on the battlefield and how they differentiate from each other. Now the first faction that we are going to take a look at here is the Caldari State. Now this faction is a shield-based faction, and they do rely on controlling the battlefield with application, and they also are the only faction in the game that is able to choose the DPS output on the field, meaning that they have the choice of damage to apply versus other factions who are stuck with dual application. Now if you do choose the Caldari State on the battlefield as your choice of ship for engagement, you do have to note to yourself how to understand the shield-based format and its resistances. And how you can get a fast understanding of that is by looking at this basic Caldari frigate right here. Now before we add on any of the resistance bonus, you can see that it has a flat base resistance of 50% against explosive resistance and 40% against kinetic. Now when it does come to shield, whether it is small, medium, or large based buffer or active repping builds, that you do always have to note to yourself that the base resistances of shield is explosive and kinetic, and their weakness will be thermal and EM. So do not forget that as a Caldari State player out on the battlefield, and always make sure that you are choosing the correct engagements towards your shield-based profile, and trying to always make sure that the enemy weapons play into that resistance. Now the next aspect of the Caldari State that you do have to memorize and understand is how they control the type of damage that is applied out on the field, and that is by using either rockets or missiles. Now it's not just the fact that you do have the power to control the damage type that is being applied out on the battlefield, but you do have to understand that the rocket systems are used for brawling and mid-range control and will fire faster than the light missile systems, which are used for long-range kiting and long-range control as well. Now the Caldari State is one of the most powerful factions in the game when it does come to controlling the enemies on the battlefield, and they do this not just in the output of the damage type, but also by controlling their enemies with application. Now once you understand in the game that the Caldari State are kings of application, you first must understand how they obtain this application, and they do this by using a stasis webifier. Now a stasis webifier will reduce the speed of your enemy target, but also will allow you to apply full application of your explosion radius, whether it's from your rockets or your missiles. Once you do understand this, whether you are on the field as a Caldari pilot controlling your enemies with application, or you are facing any Caldari ship yourself, you do start to realize that any engagements on the field against a Caldari pilot, you will face stasis webifiers, or if you yourself are a pilot in a Caldari vessel, then make sure that you do have one as well. Now when it does come to the 4 main factions here in EVE Online, each faction does have a secondary main utility that it does like to use, and each one of these secondary utilities does come from the electronic warfare side of the game. And here in the Caldari State, the electronic warfare system that they favor the most is ECM, or known as jams. Now the basis of ECM is that you can use it towards your enemy opponent, making sure that they will not be able to lock you or apply to you any of their modules as long as the duration of the jam is active. Now you can see right here in this basic T1 electronic frigate from the Caldari State that there is many types of ECM, i.e. jam types of utility-based combat choices that you could choose from, and each one of them does have a specific strength and weakness towards different ships. They also do apply up close and at long range. Use ECM drones, which are very powerful and in times of need can help you break away from your enemy and escape the battlefield or even help you win the fight. Once you do understand these basic principles of this faction in the game, and you do realize that the shield-based defensive format is the fastest repairing format and auto-regenning format in the game, and that their weaknesses are EM and thermal-based damage, and that if you do hit them hard enough, they will bleed into the armor, and noting that they are kings of application and should and always utilize the power of the web of fire, and that their secondary tactic is the powerful ECM. Now that you do have a basic understanding of the Caldari State, let's get into the next faction. Alright, the next faction that we are going to take a look at now is the Gallente Federation. Now this is one of the hardest hitting factions in the game, as they do rely on getting up close and personal with their vessels, as they do use the blaster gun weapon system, which is the most hardest hitting weapon system in the game. And this faction is a structure tank faction, which also does secondary into armor, and it is also one of the rare factions in the game that does specialize specifically into drones, and that your main goal and positioning should always be to get as close to your enemy. This way you can apply as much DPS as possible. Now the fastest way to get an understanding of the offensive capabilities of the Gallente Federation, as they do hyperclass into guns and drones, is you first have to understand their defenses. And one of the main defenses here for this faction is your structure tank, as with this faction you can stack it the highest and allows you the most mobility and survivability and design capabilities with your ship when you do use the structure tank. But noting to yourself that they do secondary into armor, but structure should be their main goal and design. Now when you do look at the resistances here from the damage control 2 applied to your structure tank, you do see that you get a base resistance of 60% across the board. Now you do have to understand that when it does come to using a structure tank vessel, not only can you stack the HP percentiles, but it is also a base neutral resistance. What I mean by that is a base example when it does come to structure tank versus armor is armor does have a heavier base resistance against smashing and penetrating hits, where structure tank is just neutral across the board. Next, you do have to note here that they are the highest hitting faction in the game, meaning that their weapon systems do outpace other weapon systems, but you do have to be up close to do it. Now not only do you have to be up close, but you do have to make sure that you are using the Gallente Federation's weapon systems, which are the blaster gun. Now these guns do come in 3 different types of weapon systems, not just in small, medium, or large, but they do come in different combat style of gun systems as well. Now the first gun system would be the electron blasters. Now this gun system does fire faster than the other gun systems, but will do less damage over time. The second weapon system that you do have to choose from is the ion blasters. Now these are the neutral based gun system here in the Federation, and will give you a medium output across the board. And the final weapon system is the most powerful DPS output weapon system in the game, and that is the neutron blasters. Now these do fire slower than the electron blasters and do have a slower pace output than the ion blasters, but in the end will lay down more firepower upon your enemies than both weapon systems combined. And always remembering that each faction in the game does have a secondary weapon system that does utilize into long range capabilities, and here in the Gallente Federation they do use the railgun system. Now the railgun system, like all gun-based systems here in EVE Online, are a tracking versus velocity system. What that does mean in the end is the faster that you can go, the harder it is for them to track. Now the next thing that you do have to note here when it does come to the Gallente Federation is that they are the most powerful faction in the game when it does come to utilizing and setting forth what we call drones. And drones in itself on the battlefield are highly unique, because as long as you get first strike and do apply them to your enemy, no matter what happens to you or your locking capabilities, they always still will apply. As you can see right here on the DPS output of this destroyer, that almost 200 DPS of the damage is based upon the drones. Now the things that you do need to understand about the drones is that your enemies can lock them and take them out, reducing the amount of damage output you have on the field. But also when it does come to the 4 types of combat drones that do exist in the game, each one in itself does have a different damage type. And here you will see that when it does come to the Hobgoblin 2s, they do dish out thermal based damage. And next you do have the Acolyte drones, and they will dish out the EM based damage. And then you would have the Hornet 2s, and they will dish out kinetic based damage. And after that you do have the Warrior 2s, and they are explosive based damage. Now each one of these drones do have uniqueness on the battlefield itself. The Gallente-based drones will hit harder. The Amarr-based drones do tend to land more hits better than the other based drones. And the Caldari-based drones will have the ability to be able to dock up inside your ship and repair themselves automatically. And when it does come to the Minmatar-based drones, they are the fastest drones in the game. Now when it does come to the Gallente Federation's electronic warfare side capabilities of the battlefields, they do tend to favor towards sensor dampeners. Now what this does is gives you the capability to not only make it harder for your opponent to lock you, but also make it incredibly hard for them to reach the range at which you are locking them, meaning that you significantly reduce the range that they are able to lock you at, and you are always able to obtain that first strike capability, which in EVE Online is most important out on the battlefield. Once you do understand these basic tactics, when it does come to this faction here in the game, you do start to realize that when it does come to the defenses of Structure Tank, that it is neutral across the board, and that it can be heavily affected by all weapon types in the game, which means that you do have to get up close and personal to dish out the highest DPS output, but you also do have to face the downside that they will be able to apply heavy DPS to you as well. And even though that you can dish out the highest DPS damage output in the game, you are limited to the damage type that you can dish out, which is thermal and kinetic. But you do also specialize into the damage output of drones. And remembering that even though you can maintain the damage output with your drones, they still can be eliminated, reducing your DPS on the field. And also noting highly here that when you do use heavily based structure tank vessels, that it is best to always combine them with an ancillary repper, giving you a fast, powerful defensive combo out on the battlefield. Now that you understand that the Gallente Federation in itself is a heavily based brawling faction here in the game, we can get into the next faction now. Now the next faction that we are going to take a look at here is the Amarr Empire. Now this is a heavily based armor faction and a mid-range brawling faction, as well as long-range control. And remember you guys that EVE Online is a social-based sandbox, so you should be playing with others, as when I do make that statement when it comes to the Caldari State and this faction here, the Amarr Empire, they are the most powerful factions when it comes to fleet formation, and that they have the highest amount of low slots when it does come to creating your ship builds and designs, and that in the end they truly become the most tankiest and most resistant faction here in the game. So if you are the type of player that does like those tanky style vessels and high resistance against your enemies while peppering them from mid-range with your laser weapon system, then this faction may be calling you. Now to get a fast understanding of the powerful defenses of this faction, you can take a look at this basic Tech 1 frigate right here, and you will see that when it does come to armor, they are reverse of the shield class vessels, as their weaknesses are explosive and kinetic, so do make sure to pay attention to that when you are on the field. Now, as you can see, the Amarr Empire does have the highest amount of low slots in any ship composition in the game. This is what allows them to be the most resistant and most tankiest, as I can give you guys an example of the exact same ship right here. Now you can see that I have switched the damage modules with more resistant modules using the multi-spectrum energized membrane 2. Allows me to stack more resistances against my enemy, as you guys can see right there, making Amarr vessels one of the most tankiest and resistant vessels in the game. Not only because you could stack them with such high power resistance, but also you do get the ability to abuse the armor class plates. Now you can use the 400 plate, which is best suited for small vessels, or the 800 plate, which is best suited for medium class vessels, or the 1600 millimeter plates, which are available for the larger class vessels in the Amarr Empire. Not only is there multi-spectrum energized membrane 2s for resistances, but there is other resistant based modules as well, such as ones for EM, thermal, kinetic, and explosive. Remember you guys that in EVE Online it is up to you to choose your ship design and the modules on your ship, so do make sure that when you choose your resistance profile that you do choose the proper engagements to your resistance. Now when it does come to the gun weapon systems here from the Amarr Empire, they do rely on the laser based weapon system, which does use EM and thermal based weapon damage. Now the Amarr are kings of mid and long range control when it does come to fighting their enemies, and their extra resistance and tank allows them to be able to withstand the barrages from their opponents, especially if they do get close, because when you do use the laser gun weapon system and your opponent is able to get up close to you, it does become incredibly hard for you to track them, as the laser gun systems do have a hard time to track versus velocity, but they do lay down a heavy stream of fire and one of the most consistent streams of firepower when using the Gatling laser systems as well. Now when it does come to the laser systems here in the Amarr Empire, they do have 3 types for both the brawling pulse lasers and the long range beam lasers. So as a fast example, if we do look at this one right here, these are the Gatling pulse lasers. Now these will fire faster than any laser system in the game, and these are the most consistent DPS weapon systems that there is, until they created the Trigvalian weapon systems, but that is another story. And next you do have the dual light beam lasers. Now these are a solid neutral skirmishing weapon and will always do best at mid-range. And lastly, we do have the small focus pulse lasers. Now these are the heaviest hitting gun system in the Amarr Empire and will fire in a pulse-like fashion. Do remember that on impact they can burn through your armor and especially your shield. Now once you do understand that this faction heavily does favor armor and resistance, but they do heavily favor one of the electronic warfare factors, and that is neutralizing your enemy's capacitor, making sure that when they do try to come up close to you against your weak spots, you are able to drain and nuke them out and once again pull range back to your mid position. Now when you guys do want a fast understanding of energy neutralizers, yes, there is small, medium, and large size neutralizers, and each one does neutralize a higher amount as you scale, but you do always have to take into account that even though you are using the neutralizers to attack your enemy's capacitor, it does eventually drain yours as well. So do make sure that you always do use your energy neutralizers with capacitor based modules. That way you do secure your own capacitor and can make sure that you are able to nuke out your enemy as well. Not just only are they powerful at mid and long range brawling, but they do at times have the ability to use drones, and you could swap the ammunition types almost instantly. Once you are able to understand the tactics with this faction, you then never forget that they are a full armor class faction and that their weapon types heavily are based into the laser gun weapon systems, but yet they can secondary into drones at times. And even though the armor repairing modules do repair slower than the shield repping modules, they do have a higher base resistance against impact, saving you against smashing and penetrating hits in the end. So do always make sure to combine your armor base modules either with dual repping capabilities or single ancillary reppers, and never forgetting that this is a heavily based EM and thermal faction, and that their electronic warfare capabilities heavily favor into the energy neutralizers. Now that you guys have a good understanding of this faction, let's get into the next one now. And the next one that we are going to go over is the Minmatar Republic. Now this is a unique faction in itself, as it is a hybrid of all 3 of the factions in the game, meaning that out on the battlefield it will utilize all 3 defenses, and it can also utilize all 3 offensive tactics as well. Now one of the main benefits of choosing this faction is that they are the kings of speed in the game, and they have the highest agility out of most vessels out on the battlefield. So if you do like the cunningness of speed and using that to lay down heavy firepower with your projectile weapon systems, then this faction is one for you to look at. Now if you do choose the Minmatar Republic as your faction of choice out on the battlefield, then you first do need a fast understanding how to use the power of their speed and agility against the power of the other factions. Now to get a fast understanding of how to do this, you do first have to take a look at this basic frigate right here. Now when it does come to this basic Tech 1 frigate from the Minmatar Republic, you do have to always note and remind yourself that when you do use this faction, that they truly are a hybrid of all the other factions and can be anything defensively, whether it is shield, armor or structure tank, and here with this one it is armor based, but also you do have to note highly that the Minmatar Republic is a highly defensive faction, and they use their speed and their webifiers to maintain distance on the enemy weapons, and in the end laying down firepower of their own. Now the next aspect that you do have to memorize when it does come to this faction is how to use your web defensively, as you do always need to keep your enemies at bay and at maximum distance that their weapons can produce in range. That way they are always getting grazing or missing hits, allowing you to always control and pull away from any heavy brawler. And the most efficient way to do this as the Minmatar Republic is to combine either your micro warp drive engine or your afterburner with the agility based modules and the speed based modules such as the nanofiber internal structures and the overdrive injectors as well. Now when you do learn to combine this with the power of the stasis webifier, but not in a Caldari offensive style fashion, but in a hard defensive style fashion, then you start to realize that speed is always king here in EVE Online. Now once you do learn that the Minmatar Republic is the most powerful mid-range control faction, what that means in simple terms is they do not let their opponents get close, and they do not let their opponents keep them afar. They always keep their opponents at mid-center range, and that allows them to lay down perfect firepower with their weapon systems. Now not only do you have to keep in mind that you must always use the stasis webifier in a defensive position, making sure that your enemy's weapon systems can never apply to yours, abusing that power of agility with this faction. But you do need a fast understanding when it does come to the Minmatar weapon systems, and here they do favor the projectile weapons, and their secondary long-range weapon is artillery. Now when it does come to the projectile weapon system, they are an explosive and kinetic based damaging weapon system, but they do have the ability to brawl at mid and close range. So combining that aspect with the power of the speed from this faction does make it a formidable ship to face on the field. Now the second thing that you do have to teach yourself here is that the artillery weapons itself are unique in the game, as they are designed specifically to destroy and rip apart armor, not just lay penetrating hits down on the shield based ships, but also literally to destroy and wreck and smash the armor based vessels. Once you do start understanding this, you are quick to realize that the Minmatar weapon systems and their secondary choice of weapon systems do not rely on capacitor, thus you are able to add other modules and even pressure your enemy's capacitor as well. When you do add those tactics with the defensive speed and play control of the Minmatar Republic, then you are fast to realize that this faction is extremely powerful, but it does truly rely on piloting skill, not error. When you are looking towards the electronic warfare side of this faction, they do tend to favor towards increasing the signature radius of your enemy's vessel, as they do have some of the lowest signature radiuses in the game, making it easier for your weapon systems to apply. Once you do start understanding this information when it does come to this faction, you quickly do learn that they are not just only the fastest faction in the game, but they are also the biggest hitting faction, meaning when you do use the artillery weapons for destroying and wrecking armor, they also do take massive chunks out of every other defensive capability as well. And not forgetting that their main damage type is explosive and secondary is kinetic, and that always utilizing speed as your main tank and defensive asset. Also combining it with the other speed modules does make it extremely hard for the other factions to keep pace. And lastly, not forgetting that when it does come to creating your defenses with the Minmatar Republic, that they are a hyperclass faction of all of the other factions in the game, meaning that even though the Minmatar Republic is a heavily based shield tank faction, you still can create your defensive systems into structure tank and armor, where the other factions will struggle in this triple capability as well. Alright, now that you guys do have a fast understanding and the basics of what it is like to choose one of these factions out on the battlefield, you are then fast to realize that there is no best faction in the game, and that there is no best ship. That when it does come to combat in EVE Online, that every single ship in the game is situational, and every single ship design is situational as well. When it comes to creating ship designs in the game as a player, you do always have to remind yourself to make sure that you are getting your ship design into your specific situations, and that you need to teach yourself that this game specifically is designed around player-to-player interaction, and that every single thing you do in the game is nothing more than a side quest into the ISK faucet, which in the end will lead you back into player-to-player interaction and PvP. If you guys did make it all the way to the end of the video, please do like and subscribe, and I hope you guys are all staying safe out there. Catch you guys in the next one. Peace.